and as well in Vancouver, we had a few years of heavy anti-globalization organizing prior to the WTO. So by the time Vancouverites were coming down to the WTO, we were ready. We'd had a few years of the Asia-Pacific Economic Conference coming to Vancouver, thousands of people protesting, hundreds and hundreds of people pepper sprayed without cause, literally for peaceful protests. A lot of arrests, a lot of intimidation, harassment of organizers, and then the response the next year at our next large, about 1,500 person protest was batons, to wade into a peaceful crowd with batons and bash about 40 people's heads in, sending 4 to the hospital. And that was because we were greeting our own Prime Minister come to Vancouver to do fundraising. So we had that experience already of larger mass actions and uniting diverse causes under really heavy police scrutiny and risk of violence in the streets prior to coming down to the WTO. So that was a really great beginning to the anti-globalization movement in Canada, and there were a lot of events after that, the G8 in Kananaskis and the Summit of the Americas in Quebec. And then, as Garth spoke about, a downturn and relocalization into other struggles and dealing with the issues of the anti-war movement. And now we come to 2010, and you guys are probably already familiar. Vancouver and Whistler are jointly hosting the 2010 Winter Olympics, which will be occurring starting on February 12th, running through, counting the Paralympics, through to the end of March. And there's a lot of propaganda around the Olympics. It's a very different thing to target than something like the WTO. Anybody involved in environmentalism, corporate issues, labor, it's easy to understand why free trade is a problem. It doesn't have the glossy advertising campaign of something like the Olympics. And literally, I've never fought an enemy that every time I go into the store, every single product has an Olympic logo on it. That doesn't happen when you go to the WTO. You don't go into your pharmacy and see that your pack of gum has a WTO logo on it. It is ubiquitous. They are really, really shoving this down your throats. Every TV ad, every source of information you have, all of our media are either former, current, or future Olympic sponsor corporations. So getting out the word to the public about the issues around the Olympics is really difficult. So while I have a chance to talk to you guys, there are a lot of, will be familiar to you, reasons to oppose at least the negative impacts of the Games, if not the Games as an industry. Certainly in the case of British Columbia, it's rather unique. The vast majority of British Columbia land is unceded Indigenous territory, which is to say it's never been settled by treaty or conquest. So there's technically no legal claim by British Columbia or Canada to this native land. And so you're talking about people that have been fighting for their sovereignty for hundreds of years under great amount of state repression that are now being forced to host these games. Additionally, the natural resources, the beauty and splendor of British Columbia that everybody advertises, but also the very snow, the roads, the gravel, the trees, the cement, the physical materials being used to build the games are also native resources that have been unceded. So not only is there the usurpation of the resources and the land, but there's also the appropriation of native imagery. You may have noticed in some of the Olympic promotions the Inukshuk, which is basically a structure of stones that resembles a man in the Olympic advertisements, which is meant to be, as it's used by Indigenous people, a guidepost to guide you from one location to another through the Arctic. This is actually an Inuit symbol. This is not a Coast Salish British Columbia native symbol. It's actually something imported from the Inuit. So it's as if you were hosting something in Seattle and the food for the event was gumbo. It's got nothing to do with the local culture or community, but it's one of the many ways in which they're appropriating native imagery to try and promote the Olympics as being supported by native people, whereas in fact there's a great deal of division in native communities about holding the games. And certainly the fact that this is unceded land, an issue still being looked at by the UN, means that there's something inappropriate about having hosting these events on land that is unceded without addressing these outstanding human rights, social, educational, and environmental issues of those communities. Additionally, some people will be familiar with the issues of the type of corporate sponsors that are being honored and promoted through the Olympics. We're talking about people like General Electric, General Motors, Petro-Canada, which is heavily invested in the tar sands, the giant industrial mega project that puts something like the Three Gorges Dam to shame in its size and impact and the amount of cancer that it's causing in Native communities, and the fact that these rivers that are being damaged flow towards Native communities. If they turned the other way and flowed to Edmonton and brought that kind of destruction of environment and health to a city like Edmonton, they would never be allowed to proceed. But the fact is the damage is done to Native communities, and so these people are allowed to continue. Also, companies like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Royal Bank also invested in the tar sands, and Dow Chemical, these people with good reputations. So when you look at, not only are they sponsoring their own media to promote their side, but they're actually funded by these kind of union-busting, environmentally damaging, tar sands supporting arms manufacturing corporations. So a lot of the resistance is certainly to specific corporations and their records, but also the commercialization of our public space. Vancouver's large buildings downtown are literally draped. If you work in one of these buildings, you now work under a blackout curtain, because giant several-story buildings are draped with Olympic advertising. I say Olympic advertising, but it's primarily corporate sponsor advertising. Giant Canadian flags with a Coca-Cola on them, Hudson's Bay Corporation ads that take up a massive amount of public space, and additionally, in every media that carries a story saying that people's criticisms about the Olympics aren't valid also has an Olympic sponsor logo on the top, and yet people wonder that they're not getting the straight story about the Olympics. Another issue that's particularly important to Vancouver is housing, shelter beds, and affordable housing during what we have a housing crisis going on right now in Vancouver, and we have for several years. Since the bid in 2003, homelessness has actually tripled in Vancouver. We've lost 850 what we call low-income hotels. These are single-room occupancy units, one tiny room, no bathroom, no kitchen, and they're all you can afford with a welfare check in Vancouver. A lot of them are centralized in what is the poorest neighborhood in North America, the Downtown East Side. The Downtown East Side has the worst rates of things like people living in poverty, people having their children taken away by the government, HIV infection rates, drug use rates, illiteracy rates, people living with disabilities. It's an extremely marginalized and oppressed community. And homelessness concentrated in that area, social services concentrated in that area. This is also where a lot of Olympic events are happening, so there's a great effort to clean that up. But with the bid, we were promised affordable housing increases. This was supposed to be the legacy of the 2010 Games, one of affordable housing and a permanent contribution to shelter beds. Instead of affordable housing, as we were promised, Vancouver actually went into debt to shell out money to developers to build the Athletes' Village. This was supposed to be affordable and social housing. It's now going to be luxury condos that we're not even sure we can sell. Additionally, they made promises of permanent contribution to shelter beds. Instead, we're going to get temporary shelters outside of the city, open only during the period of the Games. So the idea isn't so much to make a permanent contribution to shelters, but actually to sweep the poor undesirables for the international media out of the city during the Games. Additionally, they've brought in something that we're calling the Olympic Kid